Are the laws on refugees fit for purpose? A Lib Dem row about house building targets. And why have we had so many Prime Ministers recently? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Local Government Minister Lee Rowley, Shadow Employment Minister Alison McGovern, Political Editor of The Telegraph Ben Riley-Smith and Rachel Cunliffe from The New Statesman. Today,
people using asylum claims as a basis for what is essentially economic migration it is not sustainable.
The Home Secretary thinks the international rules on refugees aren't working. Is she right? Ed Davey will be addressing the Lib Dem conference later. But why has the party been arguing about house building targets?
Vague targets let and empower developers to build the houses that they want, but never, ever, ever the homes that we desperately need, especially that young people actually need.
People know that there's something deeply unfair about being taxed all their lives and then being taxed in death as well.
Should the government scrap inheritance tax?
Hasta la vista, baby. Thank you.
I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
I stand here before you, ready to lead our country into the future.
We've had a lot of Conservative Prime Ministers recently. Can this one reinvent the party in time for the next election? Let's start with reports that the government is looking at either scrapping or slashing inheritance tax. This headline in The Times. Rishi Sunak draws up plans to slash inheritance tax. Targeting the most hated tax in Britain is just one of the crowd-pleasing policy changes in the mix for the Tory conference, which starts at the weekend. So my opening question to the panel, we heard Grant Shapps too, in the headline saying it's deeply unfair. Is it?
Well, it's certainly taxing people a second time after they've already been taxed through their life. So from a Conservative perspective, from somebody who believes in lower tax, in the state being as effective as it possibly can be, and people having as much of their money as they possibly can, we'd like to lower all taxes. But we also recognise we're in a challenging economic time, that the government finances are difficult, and so we're going to have to work through whether that's possible or not.
So scrap it or not?
I'm not here. I'm not the Chancellor, so I can't answer that question. I'll say that up front. All Conservatives want to lower taxes. That's part of our DNA. That's our makeup. So over time, over a number of years, we will want to see taxes reducing. But I can't make policy here.
Is it deeply unfair, inheritance tax, Alison?
Well, it's paid by a very small proportion of the population and in a very specific geographical area, by and large. But I'll be honest, Jo, and I hear them talk about this. I think, was it only a year ago that I was at Labour Party conference listening to what the consequences of the mini budget was when Liz Truss brought forward uncosted, unfunded tax cuts that sent our economy into chaos. And yet here we are a year later, and I ask myself what's changed. Every time I come on the telly, I am rightly asked on any of Labour's policies, you know, how are you going to pay for that? How are you going to pay for that? And here we are with the Tories yet again wanting to talk about cutting tax and, you know, not taking that responsibility seriously to manage our economy.
But philosophically,
everybody in our country paid the price for that mistake.
Philosophically and more broadly on inheritance tax, it's charged at 40% for estates worth more than £325,000 and an extra £175,000 allowance towards a main residence if it is passed to children or grandchildren. And a married couple can share their allowances, and that means parents can pretty well pass on £1 million to their children without any tax to pay. Is it fair?
I think that, as I was saying before, I think it's paid by a very small part of the population. The vast majority of people can, as most people would want to do, pass assets on to their children. You know, we could always look at tax reforms to try and make it better. But as I say, I cannot believe we're here again.
I think you probably can believe it. In the tax year 2020 to 2021, Ben, 3.73%. Alison is right. Very few people of UK deaths resulted in an inheritance tax charge. Is it deeply unfair, as Grant Shapps says?
Well, only a tiny number of people pay for it. There's a whole debate about whether you want to tax wealth or not. I suppose supporters of it would say, look, even though some of this income is taxed twice, people have huge amounts of wealth and wealth is undertaxed, so we should go for it. But I mean, separate from that, you can see why the Tories are interested in it, because it's all about the election. They are desperate to try and say a tax bomb is coming with Labour, and Keir Starmer's shut down the idea that he'll raise income tax or wealth tax. But if they do, scrap inheritance tax and Labour doesn't promise to reinstate it, then you've got that dividing line.
I mean, it's unlikely that the Chancellor will announce it, because he said it will be unlikely for tax cuts to be announced in the budget. But do you think it is deeply unfair inheritance tax, Rachel?
No, I think if you were looking at taxes that you might want to bring down, because taxes in this country are at a historic high, that's probably the last one that you'd look at, because as we've discussed, it affects 4% of estates. That means that 96% people either don't pay it at all or they don't have an inheritance to pay it on. Also, it's not double taxation. We talk about it like it is. It's not paid for by the person who's dying. It's paid for by their heirs, their children, who have inherited it, and who, of course, we want people to be able to pass things on to their children, but who, let's be honest, have done nothing to earn it. If you look at the tax burden as a whole over the course of the country, if we look at, for example, tax thresholds, which have dragged people into paying income tax and paying the higher rate of income tax, I think 4 million extra people are paying income tax in this country because of the failure to uprate those thresholds with inflation. Those are working people, and I think if you want to cut taxes, which clearly the Conservatives do, why not target a tax cut at people who are actually earning money rather than people who have done literally nothing other than wait for their parents to die?
I mean, Lee, you said it's unfair. How many people in your constituency pay inheritance tax?
Well, it's not about my constituency, it's about a principle of taxation. Should we raise any more in taxes than we need to? No, and that's generally been the Conservative philosophy for many decades. But I just want to come back on this point about other taxes. We've raised thresholds, we've raised the basic level of tax on a number of occasions over the past 13 years. We have looked at other taxes and they've been reduced. We reduced fuel duty, for example, last year. But the best way in which we can reduce taxes, reduce the implications on hard-working people,
is the highest tax burden
is to get inflation down, which is what we're trying to do.
But can I just say, geography does, and I'll come on to that, but just for people watching, North East Derbyshire is your constituency, and it is a trick question, because so few people pay inheritance tax in your area. The HMRC doesn't even release the figures.
But again, the point, Jo, is that ultimately taxation is paid for across the country, and we have to try and get a tax system which works for the entire country and which balances up all of these very important things, which are making sure we have public services that work, investing in our infrastructure for the long term, but ensuring that we don't take any more money from people, whether it's in North East Derbyshire or Wirral, anywhere else that we need to.
I thought we all agreed that we need to level up this country, that geography does matter in our economy, that where we get our wealth and our income does matter, and that all parts of our economy must be included in that. And yet here we are talking about this issue for a reason, which is the one that Ben points out, right? Which is because it's not economics, it's politics.
Well, I'm very happy. I'm very happy to debate levelling up. In my part of the world, £50 million for regeneration of towns, and new hospital A&E, and Wirral, where I was over in your patch just a few weeks ago as a minister announcing the investment zone. We are doing a huge amount across the East Midlands and the North in order to make sure that we are supporting people for the long term. But that doesn't change the question about tax and where we do and where tax burden should lie.
We'll return to levelling up another time. I'm sure it will form a different discussion. We're going to talk about Suella Braverman and refugees, because the Home Secretary is due to give a speech in Washington, D.C. later on today. Let's have a look at how the right-leaning newspapers are covering it. The Daily Telegraph, first of all. Braverman, 780 million refugees, shows rules must change. This is the front page of the Daily Express. Suella urges reform of absurd migrant system. And finally, the Daily Mail. Suella, Channel migrants are not refugees. She is expecting, Suella Braverman, to question whether the application of the United Nations 1951 Refugee Convention is fit for our modern age. The convention was drawn up after World War II. It has at its heart the principle that refugees should not be returned to countries where they face threats to their life or freedom. Is she right, Lee, to question international rules that have been in place since 1951 and say or question that they're not fit for purpose?
I think it's pretty reasonable for the government and for people like Suella who are involved in this discussion every single day to look at every single avenue to try and resolve our migration problem and to try and resolve some of these things which people in places like North East Derbyshire are absolutely outraged about and want action on. The government's trying to take that action, but it's very difficult to do so. And we are seeing similar challenges all around the world. So there are global issues here, and it's perfectly reasonable, I think, for Suella to raise questions about how we resolve those issues collectively.
Do you agree about raising questions about the UN Refugee Convention?
I think the government would have more credibility if it got on with the job at home. I think the backlog of asylum cases is a disgrace. It harms those people who need our support, and it makes us less safe and secure as a nation. I think if Labour were in government tomorrow, we would take a different approach. We would prioritise getting that backlog down, saving the money that we're spending out, millions on hotels and so on, to make the system work properly. That would make us more safe and secure as a country, and would be a better way to build the kind of international cooperation we need to make the system work better on a global scale.
It is just a distraction, isn't it? It is a distraction from the failure. A failure at every level in terms of stopping small boats, as Rishi Sunak said, in clearing the backlog, which has been extremely high, and the bill for refugees in hotels. This is a distraction from all of that.
One of the ways you get the bill cost in the hotel down, or you get the queues down, the number of people who were trying to make a decision on an asylum cases, is by ensuring that fewer people turn up in our beaches, having come from France, where they're not in imminent peril. So the only way you do that is by looking at every part of the system and being willing to take on things which may have worked and did work and were fantastic many years ago, but it's perfectly reasonable to say, does this work still for today? The fundamental point is that the British people have to have the final say in who comes to this country, when they come, and the manner in which they arrive, and we need to look at all elements of the process.
Well, one could argue that I suppose they do to some extent. But, Lee, on that base of what you said, are you and should the government consider pulling out of that convention?
Well, let's wait and see what Suella says today. She's talking about this in detail and with nuance and recognising that there's a lot of considerations which need to be made here. But as a principle, should we look at every part of the process to make sure that we're resolving the boats issue and making sure that we're not mixing up asylum with economic migration? Yes, we should absolutely do that.
Are you saying that you wouldn't question, Labour wouldn't question anything about our commitments internationally, or at least look at some of the conventions that have been in place?
Well, Keir Starmer recently met President Macron in France precisely to try to build up those kind of relationships particularly with our nearby neighbours, so that we can make that process, Jo, that you described, work better. Having listened to Lee just then, I'm not actually sure what we're debating here. What is the policy that the government are suggesting? Maybe the Home Secretary could come to the House of Commons and announce what her policy change is, so that we can be clear and so that the British people can know exactly what it is that the government are suggesting. As I say, at the moment, it does just look like the creation of headlines, whilst the job here at home of dealing with the backlog, all right, we need to think about every part of the process, but the backlog of people that are here already needs dealt with.
The backlog
and that is
will
not
never go
being
down
done
until you have a broader discussion about the questions, about how we resolve these issues.
That's not true. We previously had issues in the system. There was a backlog built up, and under the last Labour government, it was dealt with. We can do that job again.
And you didn't have channel boats under the last Labour government. And what we're trying to deal with here is a new phenomenon. You will never resolve the backlog until you ultimately work out how to make the process work and how to make the principles of migration and asylum work for the long term.
Why not get more caseworkers? Why not improve productivity?
Well, the government said it has done that to some extent. But actually, Alison raises an interesting point, is why is Suella Braverman doing this now? What is it that she's actually going to propose?
Well, I think it is the early skirmishes for this huge moment that's coming later in the year, which is the Supreme Court is going to decide whether the Rwanda deportation policy is legal or not. And if it is deemed illegal, there is going to be a big debate primarily within the Conservative Party about what on earth you do now. And I think Suella is on the harder end of the immigration clampdown spectrum in the party, and some on that wing are minded to try and pull out of the ECHR. And let's see where they end up on the Refugee Convention. I think that's another whole area of debate. But I think she's trying to nudge discussion in that way for when that moment comes.
Rachel?
I think she's doing more than that. I think this is her setting out her stall for a leadership pitch. The next Conservative leadership contest is already underway. I think we'll see more of it in Manchester in the conference season. And Suella Braverman has positioned herself, strangely from within Rishi Sunak's government, as being, in a way, the main opponent to a more moderate approach and to really channeling the hardliners in the party. First it was Rwanda, then it was barges that may or may not have Legionnaires' disease on them. Then it was the ECHR and the EU, and now it's the UN Convention of Human Rights. I don't think it's about bringing down the number of migrants crossing or bringing down attempted channel crossings or anything like that. We know that it's a very difficult problem to solve. We know that some of the ways that you solve it include safe and legal routes so that people don't have to make dangerous, illegal crossings, which she herself admitted in a select committee hearing that if you are a genuine asylum seeker, unless you're coming from a very small number of countries, the only way you can claim asylum in this country is to make an unsafe, illegal crossing because there aren't any other routes. So that's one thing that you do. You also work very closely with international partners. And you try and make sure that if people come from safe countries, you do have a mechanism of sending them back. That's something that you have to negotiate with France. France takes a hell of a lot more migrants than we do. We're way below the EU average. But none of this is relevant to Suella Braverman's speech, though. It's basically about positioning herself as a future leadership contender.
What do you say to that last point, though, Lee? Is this positioning?
Suella's doing her job. And if Suella is getting the same feedback in Fareham, where she's the MP, that I'm getting in North East Derbyshire, I was knocking on doors just a few days ago, house after house after house in Claycross and Old Tupton. They just want the boats stopped. No ifs, no buts, no debates. They are good people who recognise the importance of asylum. They want to protect people who are vulnerable and who are in need, but they want the boats stopped. And they have every right to do that. And our political system is failing whilst ever that is not responded to.
So how would somebody who is from, say, Sudan or Yemen, who is a genuine asylum seeker, who has perhaps family in the UK, how would you advise that they make an asylum claim in the UK?
Not by arriving on a beach.
Right, but
how do they answer the question?
And we have examples over recent years.
No,
we have examples over recent years of legal routes, and I'm sure there will be the ability to open more in the future. But the fundamental is if you want to give people the confidence to even have that discussion, to even be able to enter into that debate, you need to ensure that we stop the boats. And the British system is not working whilst ever those boats aren't stopped.
There are, of course, safe and legal routes from Ukraine, for example, and Afghanistan, and there were at one point from Syria as well, and Hong Kong.
But I asked Lee about other countries, and he doesn't have an answer. I understand that.
Would you see expansion? Would you support expansion of safe and legal routes?
We'll have to look at it at the time, but right now we have a real challenge with the boats. The boats need to be stopped, and the only way we put confidence back in our immigration and asylum system is by fixing the boats issue.
I just think if you want to actually do something to make our country more safe and secure, you wouldn't be playing politics, as Ben describes, with the Rwanda scheme. You'd be putting that resource into our security services, into the NCA and others to make us safer. Meanwhile, even people for whom there are routes, the system fails. You know, people who served our country in Afghanistan, who the system has failed. So I think make that operation work in the Home Office properly, and you make us more safe and secure, and you help those people to whom we need to help be safe.
Let's talk about the Liberal Democrats, because they are holding their annual conference in Bournemouth. Let me just show you this headline in the Daily Mail. Lib Dems shoot down Ed Davies' bid to woo Tory voters by dropping the party's annual house-building pledge. Yes, it's been kicking off to some extent at the Lib Dem conference, somewhat surprisingly, in Bournemouth. Members have blocked the party boss's plans to scrap the Lib Dem target to build 380,000 homes a year and replace it with the target to build 150,000 social or council homes a year. Let's talk to the Liberal Democrat MP Sarah Olney. She speaks for the party on the economy. Hello to you, Sarah. So the leadership's failed to scrap its own policy on having a house building target. How embarrassing for you?
It's not embarrassing at all. We had an excellent policy debate yesterday on our housing motion. It's a really comprehensive housing motion. It covers, as you already said, an ambitious target for building more social housing. But above all, what it really wants to do is place house building at the heart of communities, so that communities have more control over the process,
Wow.
and we can really respond to voters' concerns about building the right infrastructure. It's an absolutely excellent policy motion, and we had a really, really good debate about it yesterday.
Yes, it sounds like it. We will quote Tim Farron, the former Lib Dem leader, in just a moment. Why did you want to get rid of the target to build 380,000 homes in the first place?
Well, I think what we were trying to do with that is we're saying that, you know, having a target isn't in itself helping us to build homes. There are lots of underlying reasons why we're not building homes. And actually the target then almost becomes a bit of a distraction. And in some ways it can lead to the sort of house building that's actually not helpful and not helping to fulfil the need. So that was the thinking behind wanting to scrap the target. But we've got lots of members here for whom that target is really, really important. We had an excellent debate yesterday, and the conference as a whole took the decision that they wanted to retain the target. But that's within the context of a much, much bigger, very comprehensive housing motion that we think really does meet the challenge, the huge challenge we're facing in this country of building enough new homes for people to live in.
Yes, but I mean, Tim Farron, as I say, the former Lib Dem leader, was pretty damning about young members of the party, the young Liberals, who voted to keep your 380,000 homes a year target. He called them Thatcherite. He said the authors of Amendment 1 do not mean it, but it is pure Thatcherism. He said it could be the most right-wing thing I have seen ever at Liberal Democrat conference. Do you share his low opinion of your young members?
Do you know, honestly, it was so energising, so encouraging to see
Sarah.
how the young Liberals, the younger members of our party,
Taught you a lesson.
they really got together about this, and they really, well. But, I mean, it just goes to show how much we value the views of younger members of our party, and that, you know, they were the ones who really, really pushed for this. And even our former leader couldn't stop them getting this target back into our motion. So, actually, I think it says great things about us as a party.
Is it the most right-wing thing you've ever seen at Lib Dem conference?
I'm not sure.
What is the most right-wing thing you've ever seen at a party conference, Sarah Olney? I mean, are you actually in favour of your new policy now?
I absolutely am. I mean, as I say, this is just one small part of a really, really comprehensive motion that I think will, you know, it really goes a long way to address many of the problems we're having with housing in this country. As I say, it's not just about the overall target, it's about the real commitment, the ambition to build more social housing and to really try and address some of those obstacles that are really holding us back from making a real difference on this issue.
But that target will be binding on you, will it, the 380,000?
It's now part of our party policy.
Yeah,
yes.
just so viewers know. Stay with us, Sarah, with our guests here in the studio. I mean, Lee, your manifesto says you want to build 300,000 homes a year. You've never met that target, by the way. But you've scrapped the means by which to get there by not having local housing targets. How on earth are you going to achieve it?
Or a 30-year high in terms of house building, 242,000.
Having failed all the 13 years you've been in power.
We also have to build it up, which we're trying to do. House building is not easy. That's why all three parties struggle with this at times. But what my boss, Secretary of State, has set out is that we are still aiming for 300,000 a year. We're on track for building 1 million in this Parliament, and that we're also trying to make sure there's a wide range of housing that's been built, including social housing, so that we can support people's aspirations to own, but also help those who wish to rent.
Well, when you talk about social homes, do you agree with Sarah Olney that that should be a priority in the way the Liberal Democrats are now making it, with that target of 150,000 social homes a year?
Well, it is a priority in that we have nearly £12 billion going into the Affordable Homes Programme, which will help unlock tens of thousands of affordable houses over the coming years ahead.
It's not a priority. Let me just give everyone the figures.
One of the ways in which we can, for example, build houses, including social houses, is by getting through the nutrient neutrality changes, which we've been talking about, which will allow social housing to be built.
Yes, but actually 7,500 new homes, social homes, were built, leading to a net loss of just over 14,000 homes, and that was in the year 21 to 22. You're not building enough.
One of the reasons why we're trying to encourage councils to get local plans in place, and then trying to give support with lots of taxpayer subsidy, lots of hard-working taxpayer subsidy, in order to councils still have to create local plans.
Yeah, but without targets.
And those local plans when councils have plans in place, they usually build more houses. Those houses will all contribute to the overall objective of building enough houses to support both those who need to socially rent and those who want to own, because we want to open up home ownership to as many people.
All right, well, while we're on targets, does Labour have a target for how many homes it wants to build every year?
We want to have a target, and the reason is because overall, as you know, I would hope that there would be general agreement. Overall, having a target helps it be done.
Right.
The problem is the practicalities. So I've seen this time and again where we've got a lot of brownfield areas in Merseyside, but actually we can't get those areas built out because the brownfield fund that is supposed to be there may well be underspent. We haven't got the kind of practical things like planners, local the housing associations and others haven't got the kind of resources to get that done. So I think what we've had is 13 years where this is, my experience has been, it's been getting worse. And the kind of funding that's been there, for example, the Towns Fund and other things, these competitive funds that play one place off another, rather than consistent funding over time, has held us back.
But you say you want a target. What should it be, broadly?
Well, I think I don't have I don't think that...
Is 380,000 a year a reasonable figure that the Lib Dems are proposing?
So basically all parties over the time I've been in Parliament have wanted that around that level, because if you look at the need, that's what it represents. But what I think, Jo, is that you need to make sure that you've got the ability in local areas to actually get these built out. And that's where over 13 years we've seen a lot of change, the promise of levelling up, and actually all of these funds not doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, and the homes not being built.
More than 2 million houses built in the last 13 years. So the idea that nothing has happened is for the birds. We've always got to look forward, which is what we're trying to do, and trying to say in difficult economic times that we're trying to support social housing to be built, but also making sure that we can build houses in the right place.
Why have we got brownfield areas all over the north of England that have not been built out? I remember...
Because it costs a lot of money, Alison. That's obvious why they've not all been done. Because we can't just click our fingers and make things happen. Because that's what government's about. It's about prioritising. It's about trade-offs. It's about not just saying things into a camera and then hoping they become true. We've got brownfield sites there. We're building them out over time, and we've got to get away from this fantastical politics that we just click fingers and things happen.
Well, David Cameron and George Osborne did stand in front of cameras and say that homes would be built, particularly in parts of Merseyside and other areas of the north of England where we've got the capacity to build more homes. But are you saying that actually it's become easier over the past 13 years for local authorities to actually get homes built? Because I don't think anyone thinks that's the reality on the ground. In the end, the target is important, but it's actually getting it done that matters.
Well, hang on, Alison. Before you respond, Alison, because the Labour Party does seem to have changed its tune, if you think the target is right, because this was a couple of years ago, Labour Party tweet, the Conservatives' developers' charter would sell off and sell out our communities. Local people, not Tory party donors, should decide what's best for where they live. And there, did you want developers building on your green spaces without your say? Boris Johnson does. Then just a few months ago, this was the message from the Labour Party with Keir Starmer there. The hopes of a generation are being blocked by those who more often than not enjoy the secure homes and jobs that they're denying to others. Labour will choose the builders, not the blockers. We will take on planning reform to build a better Britain. Well, which is it?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. We've got to make it easier for local authorities to do the job that they're supposed to do, to identify those areas and to help get the job done. For example, Homes England needs a huge amount of reform to make sure that they can actually help put coalitions together.
Yeah, all right, but just briefly, whose side are you on? Are you on the builders or are you on the homeowners that we saw in that rather leafy village before?
I want people to have homes to live in, and I've been working to try and get homes built on brownfield land in my constituency for years, and this government has made it harder, not easier.
Rachel?
I think you've got from this debate how challenging it is. Everyone wants to build new homes, but nobody wants to build homes near them. I should say that both Lee and Alison have blocked or objected to redevelopment in their constituency, as I should say, have the vast majority of MPs from all parties. And I'm sure you will say that you listened to local concerns and there were issues with those plans and you stood up for your constituents, and that's what you think your jobs were. However, the people who you're not listening to when you have those conversations are the thousands of people who would love to have a home, who would love to move into those developments, whose voices don't get heard. And I think we've heard throughout, we heard it from Sarah Olney, we've heard it from both of you, the importance of local people, local buy-in. Do you want this development in your local area? We're weighting it all wrong. We're weighting it for the people who already have homes and not the people who might
Rachel, I can literally take you to a site that is, you know, less than a mile from where I live, where I've been trying to get houses built.
You all have. You all have.
And it has been extremely frustrating.
Well, but there are examples of many MPs who come on this programme and say they're in favour of house building, and then we bring up a planning application of a house building project that they've just blocked.
But it's not irreconcilable to both say we want house building, which we all do, and we want to ensure that there's a deliverable plan. Then is your argument, Rachel, that we should approve and agree to anything, anywhere, no matter what? Because that's bonkers. If that's the logical extent of your argument, it's perfectly reasonable for me to say yes in many places, but in some places, actually, we need to think about it.
What I'm suggesting is that you weigh the views of the people who might like to live in those homes, not just the ones who are already there. Those people don't get counted. The people who can never afford to get on the housing ladder, they never get counted. And so, yes, I think there should be a weakening in the rights of local people to object to a development because it's on a car park where they want to park their car, or it might obstruct their view slightly. I think the right of people to have homes matters more than somebody else's right to have their perfect view.
All the parties say they want to build more homes to a greater or lesser extent, but can any of it get done?
Well, no, the problem is the massive elephant sitting in the entire debate is NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard. Every party says they want to build lots of homes. Every party says somehow we want to protect communities from being built in the green spaces. The reason the Lib Dems were so didn't want to adopt this big national target is every single by-election they absolutely hammer the Tories and saying, look, the Tories are going to build homes here, here and here. And it's won. It worked for them in Amersham, where they won a kind of shock victory in a Tory safe seat, and they wanted to do that strategy for the next election. So they are now bound by their own members to have this high target, so it's going to be much trickier to make those attacks.
I mean, how difficult is that for them, Rachel?
Well, it's incredibly successful in local elections, as Ben says. You're seeing it now in mid-Bedfordshire, you saw it in Somerton and Frome. It works as an effective campaign. Unfortunately, what it does is it turns this debate into, if you already have a house, all of the parties will leap to protect you and to protect your green space and your view. I mean, there is a car park in my local area where I think it's a Lib Dem council and a Tory MP and the Labour MP as well in nearby has also objected to it because where will people park their cars? You're talking about 300 people who could have flats in that area, but the car rights of the existing residents take precedence, and all three of the parties are terrible on this.
Well, Sarah, I hope you've been able to listen to the debate, and thank you for standing there so patiently. I don't know if you heard Ben Riley-Smith, our guest here in the studio, talking about the politics of this, and that is the Lib Dem strategy, using house building as a political strategy to win by-elections.
I mean, I can't comment on every campaign we've ever run, but what I do know is that, you know, the Tories are the ones who are always putting out leaflets saying the Lib Dems want to build all over the green belt. You know, it's the Lib Dems who want to, you know. So I mean, it is a campaigning tactic, but it's not one that we are, you know, particularly, you know, always the first to use. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what I do know is that it is extremely difficult sometimes to when you've got constituents coming to you and saying, well, we don't like this, that, or the other. You know, you represent them. How can you represent their feelings? I mean, all I would say is that we have got in my constituency, I think over 1,000. Homes have been approved for building since I became the MP in 2019. I haven't objected to that. Right. There has been a lot of local feeling about it, but I completely understand what Rachel is saying, and I completely support that. So, you know, but it is really tricky.
All right, we'll look at your planning applications that have come your way after the programme. But Sarah, earlier we were talking about inheritance tax and whether it should be scrapped or not. Do you think it should be scrapped?
I mean, I don't think this should be the major priority right now.
No, but that's not my question. That's not my question. It's been talked about as to whether it's fair or not. Do you think it should be scrapped?
Well, I think only a very small number of people would benefit from it being scrapped. And if we're looking at tax cuts, then it should be about putting more money back into the pockets of working people. So for me, this wouldn't be the right priority if there are tax cuts that are being discussed. Or, I mean, even there are so many other things that you could be spending that money on that would, for me, the priority would be to be looking at reducing the waiting lists on the NHS rather than tax cuts at this time.
Sarah Olney in Bournemouth, thank you very much. Let's talk about Ben's book. It's called The Right to Rule, 13 Years, 5 Prime Ministers and the Implosion of the Tories. But before we discuss it, take a look at this.
The British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction.
The second female Prime Minister, but certainly not the last, with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
As we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable.
We set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. Given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected.
Some mistakes were made, and I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them.
Ben, what did you learn from writing the book?
Well, I'm getting a headache just watching all of those political news again that we had to cover. What I wanted to try and do is look back to 2010, this 13-year stretch of Tory rule, longer than New Labour now, 5 PMs back-to-back. That hasn't happened for 2 centuries for a single party. And try and understand how it was done, talking to 120 people, including Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and David Cameron and others. I think one of my main takeaways is you always hear this cliche that there is something more ruthless about the pursuit of power in the Tories than other parties. And I think actually the more people I talk to, that has come through as true. A lot of people kept on telling me, you have to understand they're not an ideological party, they're a power party, which is all about staying in office. So Labour was set up to represent a demographic, the working class, and to bring about a ideology, democratic socialism. The Tories are much less anchored on those points, and it allows them to shapeshift and change to where the public is much more freely, I think, than Labour.
I mean, was there anything that you learnt that surprised you about Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and their time as Prime Minister?
Well, Liz Truss was fascinating, just trying to understand, the core issue was obviously how this mini-budget grew and grew. And there was something, I think, about her personal approach, somebody called it the spinal tap approach, endlessly turning it up to 11, rather than 10. And that worked as a cabinet minister because you had other cabinet ministers or the Prime Minister who could water you down, or the civil servants. But when you're Prime Minister, nobody is telling you not to go that far. And so one of the most candid comments I got was from Kwasi Kwarteng, her Chancellor, kind of a joint author of the mini-budget, who said, look, I love Liz very dearly, she's very sincere, but she didn't have the temperament and she wasn't wired to be a Prime Minister. And if it hadn't been the mini-budget, it would have been something else she blew up on. So even if your right-hand man is saying that about you, that does cast some kind of critical light on how those 49 days played out.
And you look closely at Boris Johnson's downfall and how that played out.
Yes. Well, one of the interesting aspects we looked at was the manoeuvring that went on from other cabinet ministers at the time. So one story that we put on the front page about a week ago was about Rishi Sunak, because during Partygate, on that day, both he and Boris Johnson got fined. He actually came so close to resigning, he wrote a draft resignation statement, shared it with people in Rupert Murdoch's media empire, and was convinced not to go for it. So it's interesting, that slide, as Boris Johnson was being toppled, other leadership candidates on manoeuvres.
Right, on manoeuvres. Rachel, why do you think the Tory party has retained power for such a long period of time? Is it also a failure of the Labour Party?
I think the Labour Party had some soul-searching to do, and you can talk to Alison about whether or not that has been successful. Certainly, I think Labour tends to look inwards when they suffer a defeat and go, what's wrong with us? What are we going to do? Whether Conservatives tend to look outwards and go, how do we win those people over? And I think if you look at 2017 versus 2019, the changes in Conservative thinking and messaging and strategy in those 2 years between Theresa May and Boris Johnson going for that election is absolutely immense. They look like 2 completely different parties. So I think there is something in what Ben was saying about the Conservatives being driven by power and being better able perhaps to adapt in order to get that power. The question, though, is as we had those 5 prime ministers and all that chaos and all those personalities, how much attention was there actually on running the country versus how much attention was there on what was going on in Downing Street? And I think we're seeing the results of that now.
Alison, what do you make of Rachel's analysis on the Labour Party? Too inward-looking, perhaps?
Well, I don't know, but I mean, 2019 was a complete disaster for us. And it was about time that we put the country first and came up with a plan to give the country its future back. You know, I think, you know, I could reflect for ages about the failures of the Labour Party or, you know, my time in Parliament, but actually the country needs a new future and a new offer. And I think that was the right response to the absolute terrible loss in 2019. I think the other thing is, I absolutely agree with Rachel in what she just said about it's more about the Conservative Party. Like, people will expect me to say this, but I do think you look back on the last Labour government and you can see the achievements, and you look back on the past 13 years and you think, what have we got out of this?
Well, have we got anything out of it, Lee, the last 13 years? And do you agree with Ben that the Tory party is just more ruthless at getting rid of its leaders?
Well, of course we've got things out of it. I'm not going to bore everybody by going through them, but, you know, at a high level, more people in work, better education system, welfare that's more focused on people getting into work, lots and lots of successes. But is the question that the Conservative Party's made mistakes? Yes, clearly. Got ourselves into a really difficult position last year. We're now trying to move forward with that. The Prime Minister's brought stability to doing that. But I think there is a broader point, not read Ben's book yet, but there is a broader point that if you look around the world, you can see challenge in the political system in America, where first one-term president losing in 30 years. You can see Australia having gone through 3 prime ministers in under a decade. You know, there is something going on in Western democracies. But what does that mean for parties that have majorities? It means we've got to get on with delivering the job, which is what we're trying to do.
Well, you talked about the Prime Minister, and he wants big change, he says. Let's have a look.
I am going to bring change because I want to put this country on a different trajectory. I want a better future for our children, and we're not going to get that unless we change how we do things. And today is the first example of a big change in approach, a change in the way we do politics, to put the long-term interests of the country first, ahead of the short-term and chasing the easy way out.
What does this change agenda actually mean?
Well, saying change a lot of times.
Yeah.
In that speech, he said it 27 times.
Did he?
Yeah, we cancelled out. You saw 4 of them there. I think what happened, you know, you are an incumbent government 13 years in, and you're thinking, how on earth do we win an election when we're miles behind in the polls and the electorate is frustrated? You somehow have to embody change rather than continuity. And that's what Rishi Sunak's trying to do. I think he's going to lay out these different policies to try and do that. But it's very hard because everybody in the country will say, you've had the chance to solve this for 13 years.
Will it work?
I mean, he's had long-term decisions, and the very first thing he's done is watered down the net zero measures that are intended to help not his own election prospects, but people 10, 20, 30, 50 years in the future generations. And then the second thing he's done, we haven't got confirmation on this, but talking down HS2, which again is a transport infrastructure project that won't benefit us in the next couple of years, but will in decades to come. So it seems very short-term, immediate thinking that is intended to help Rishi Sunak maybe squeeze by and win an election, rather than actually thinking about what we need to do long-term in this country.
I mean, broadly, the party's 20 points behind Labour, maybe 18 points now. What are these big changes that we're going to see from Rishi Sunak?
You've seen the first one last week. It's levelling with the country that some of the things which governments previously have done are not achievable. So we're going to change them. My view on it.
Big changes. Beyond that, what are the big changes?
I totally agree with what Rishi Sunak did last week, and he's going to set more out in the coming weeks ahead. We've got to be straight with people. Things have changed. There's been a whole heap of big changes that have gone on: COVID, inflation, Ukraine. That's changing how we run our country. It's changing how the world works, and we have to respond to that.
Is Keir Starmer such a big change when he's going to pursue the status quo to some extent?
Keir's a reformer, you know, as DPP in his previous role in prosecutions. He changed the way things happen, and he's shown in setting out our missions and what we want to do that we are reformers and we're going to bring change to the country.
Don't leave your TV screens, because I'm going to be back at 2:30 with coverage of the Liberal Democrat leader's speech, and I'll be back tomorrow at 12:15 for more Politics Live. Bye-bye.